Is that something you also advise students to also choose between practicing at home versus practicing at a test center if they have the option to?
Yeah. So first off, this is a very personal sort of decision, right?
Of
Because
course.
people feel more comfortable in different environments. Some people don't feel comfortable testing at home and they need the testing center for that focus.
Mhm.
And then other people like would don't want to deal with anyone else, so they stay at home. Here's what I'll say. My default recommendation is take it at the testing center.
Welcome to the Sojourning Scholar podcast. In today's podcast, I'm going to be talking with Andrew Colford from GREPrep Studios, who's an expert GRE instructor. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Andrew, a question I always like to start asking my guests when they come on the podcast, especially people who are test prep experts, is I'd like to know about your foray, how you got into the world of test prep for the GRE.
So my journey begins 12 years ago. I moved to New York City without much of a plan at all about what I was going to do. I just wanted to live in New York City. And I couldn't get a job doing anything like waiting tables. I thought back to high school when I took the SAT and ACT and remembered really, really just kind of having a knack for those tests and enjoying them. And so I said, oh, I'll look into that line. And so for about 6 to 7 years in New York City, I worked on the SAT and ACT and learned all the ins and outs of standardized testing from that. But I got to a point basically where I just wasn't enjoying working with high school students as much. In that situation, there's always a parent and then the student and you, and it gets a little complicated to make sure everyone's kind of like on the same page. So I said, why don't I look at sort of the next step, which is GRE and GMAT. And I've loved doing that since then. So I don't really do much SAT, ACT anymore. I only focus on the GRE and GMAT. What I enjoy most about it, I would say, is for one thing, the students want to be there, right? No one usually is applying to grad school because their parents are making them. I'm sure there are exceptions to that, but they're motivated. They want to make their lives better, and that makes my job as an instructor much, much easier.
Wow, that's a very interesting perspective. I do like the way you put that when it comes to coaching students for the SAT and the ACT. You're coaching students who are pretty much teenagers.
Mhm.
And just said, they're forced to take SAT tutoring or ACT tutoring for the most part. I like to find the exceptional student whose values that additional
Mhm.
investment their parents are making in them outside of the learning they get from school. But to them, it's almost like, rebellious students who are just wanting to receive coaching because they're told to, not because they want to.
I've seen it all. Like
Yeah.
everything in between.
Right. Wow, it's a very interesting take. So, what was your background in college? Did you actually attend grad school or anything like that?
Yeah, so I'll be very, very open. I did not go to grad school, even though my
Okay.
whole job is helping people get into grad school. I went to Georgetown University in DC undergraduate. I went to the School of Foreign Service. And I'll say, and I think this is why I really enjoy talking to people who have a better sense of admissions. I feel like we fit together kind of like a puzzle piece. My knowledge extends to the test.
Mhm.
Like I'm very, very good at the tests. And whenever people ask me questions about grad programs, that's when I tend to send them kind of your way to people who are more
Mm,
knowledgeable about admissions.
I see. I see. Awesome. So let's get into the GRE a little bit. We just crossed the 1 year timeline when the
Mhm.
new GRE was introduced September 2023. In your experience working with students in the past year, how have they received the new version of the exam?
Sure. Well, let me start by saying that the good news is for anyone who's concerned about this switch, specifically with like materials, the materials have not changed. Content-wise, the new version of the test is almost identical to the old version of the test. The only difference is that it's shorter. So there's one fewer essay. There's only one essay now compared to two, and there are about half as many questions. So if you've been studying with older material, the official guide, the older material official guide, you're still okay. What I
Okay.
have noticed, and again, I'd be curious to hear what your experience is like further down the pipeline when people actually take these scores to schools, is that students scoring sort of in the mid range, right? In like the 150 range for verbal and quant. tend to land there on the old and new tests. It's the same. What I found is the struggle for most students who are gunning for those 160 plus scores, trying to get to those top MBA programs, is that there's much less margin for error now. Like, you miss a couple of questions and already you're almost out of the running. Now, what I don't know is, behind those doors where they make their admissions decisions, if the adcoms, the admissions committees have sort of started handicapping it. But if you want my 2 cents, I don't think this was a great way to do it, because, ETS is basically saying with a straight face, this a 160 from a test 3 years ago is the same as a 160 on this new one. And it's just not, because they're two different tests. Again, I don't want to speculate about how the people who actually make decisions for schools are going to treat that, but I have to imagine that they're taking that into account.
So, it's been a good thing for students taking the GRE because the exam got shaved off by about an hour. So a 3 hour plus exam came down to about just 2 hours. But at the same time, you have this sort of a negative where your margin for making mistakes is now extremely small compared to
Yeah.
what it used to be before. So overall, are students happy with the new experience of taking the GRE?
I feel like it's like the grass is always greener. Certainly, the shorter runtime is nice and
Hmm.
removes sort of like that test stress element. But again, I would say that the students who most have the issue are the ones who are right on that cusp, maybe hitting like 158, 159
Hmm.
on their sections, verbal and quant, and they just need to get that last boost over 160. They tend to hit a wall because of that low margin for error.
I see. I would say back in the day when I took the GRE, I would love to have one essay to write as opposed to writing those two essays.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to the writing section, which I never cared about the writing section because my engineering background, I just cared about getting high
Mm-hmm.
math scores and high verbal reasoning scores. So from that perspective, I think I would have liked taking the GRE today, all because of the removal of the one issue writing task.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then, well, you know what? They actually there were, as you said, there were two essays. There was the
Yeah.
issue and the argument, and they took away the argument one. And I personally, I liked the argument one a little bit better. Now it's just the issue essay, which I would say a little more hackable. Like,
Mm.
you can really have a nice formula and ready to go essay for the issue essay. So
Hmm.
for anyone stressing about the essay, I wouldn't too much.
I see. I
Yeah.
see. Okay. So let's switch gears and dive into actual GRE
Mhm.
prep strategies. I'd like to ask a question if we can take things from a section by section,
Mm.
the way you answer the questions. When it comes to preparing for the quant and the verbal section, what your strategies are test prep wise.
Sure. So let's start with quant. And what I always start out with when I'm first working with a student who is maybe, let's say, like 20 years out of undergrad. I've seen it. Like, I've seen people in their mid to late 40s who want to go back to grad school, and they come to me and they say, I haven't touched math for 20 years. What do I do? And I always tell them, well, here's the good news. As far away as it was, even if it was 10, 20 years ago, you have learned it before. And there's nothing new that you have to learn for this test. So, content wise, the GRE covers arithmetic, algebra, geometry, and data analysis. That's it. There's no trigonometry, there's no pre-calculus, there's no algebra 2 or anything like that. So, compared to, for instance, the SAT, there's much, much less content that you're responsible for knowing. It's more about relearning those rules and those strategies. The other important thing to remember is that, above all, the GRE is a test of your reasoning ability. That's what they're seeking to measure. Think about this from the perspective of an MBA program. Do you think like an MBA program just wants to admit people who are very good at algebra? Like, that's not the skill that they're looking for. They don't want to know how many interesting algebra rules you know. For that reason, many of the math questions can be solved using, and I won't say common sense, but sort of a more reasoned based method. And that could be something as simple as like benchmarking. So saying, oh, if they told me that the number of boys in this class is twice the number of girls, I know that the number of boys must be even. And right there, that gets rid of all the odd answer options. And I know that's, sort of like tricky and hacky, but that's the type of reasoning, quantitative reasoning, that the test is looking for. So that's on the quantitative side. On the verbal side, again, I'll sort of frame it in that way. Like, they're not looking for people who are walking dictionaries, right? It's not like they just want people who have extensive vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
So for those vocab questions, to start, I'll talk about reading in a second, but for vocabulary, what they're testing is your ability to operate in an environment with incomplete information. And I'll kind of explain what I mean by that. If you have a sentence with a blank in it, without looking at the answer options, you can make a pretty good guess about what kind of word should go in that blank. And if you can eliminate all the words that you do know, and maybe you're down to 2, and one of those words has like a negative prefix, but you're looking for a positive word, you know that the remaining word has to be correct. The little secret that I tell regardless of their starting level of vocab, is everybody will see words that they don't know. That is going to happen. That's what the test wants. The test is not interested to see how many words you know. It wants to see how you behave in a situation where you don't know words. What context clues do you use to eliminate wrong answers? And then very quickly, the reading part of it. This is something that stresses a lot of people out. You get passages on the GRE that are about, particle physics, or, some Renaissance poet that you couldn't care less about. And you're not expected to be a subject matter expert in those things. The reason the GRE chooses those topics is because it knows that those topics are boring and very few people know about them. So what the reading section is looking to evaluate is, are you able to look at how the author is making the argument? Not the content, not, like, do you understand this chemical process or something like that? But do you recognize that the author is questioning a previous hypothesis? That's the sort of reasoning that the test is looking to measure.
This video is sponsored by the Funding Masterclass for International Students by Sojourning Scholars. Are you struggling to figure out how to fund your U.S. education? You've searched high and low for scholarships and other free funding opportunities, but nothing seems to work. As a former international student, I know the challenges you're facing, having faced them myself. But I found a way to secure over $300,000 US in free funding to cover my undergraduate and graduate degrees without taking out a penny in student loan. That's why I created the Funding Masterclass for International Students. It's a step-by-step roadmap designed to help you unlock scholarships, grants, fellowships, assistantships, and more. A private community for support and much more. If you're ready to secure your future without the financial burden, head to sojourningscholar.com/FMC to enroll today. And now let's get back to the podcast. I see. I'd like to go back to the quant section for a little bit. When you work with students who are, let's say, 5+ years removed from the academic environment, these are people who have been working as professionals and they want to go back to school. To those students, I think their strategy possibly would include revising their knowledge of, like the basics of arithmetic, because some things you probably haven't used in several years. But there's also a component of your prep that needs to be understanding that nuance of the GRE and mastering strategy. Percentage-wise, how do you prefer students to allocate time towards content knowledge development versus GRE strategy mastery?
That's a great question. And I'll give you an exact answer, a rough answer. So content-wise to strategy, I would probably say about 70-30, if not 65-35.
Okay.
So there certainly are formulas that you need to know, right? Like, you have to know the Pythagorean theorem. There's no tricky way to get around that. But going back to what I was saying, like, what this test is really about is not as much content knowledge. And there are so many ways around difficult algebra if you just know where to look. So yeah, I would probably say 70-30 or maybe 65-35 in favor of content to sort of like strategy tips and tricks.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's for the quant section. For the verbal reasoning section, a very common approach out there for prepping seems to be just memorizing
Yeah.
hundreds, if not thousands of words. Where's your stance when it comes to those kind of
Sure.
test preppers?
So I always like to say this. Let's say that you get, Joe Schmo's 500 most important words for the GRE and you memorize it, cold. The likelihood that any one of those words is going to appear on the test is very, very low. And the likelihood that there will be words that you don't know that aren't in that list is very, very high. Because, and I don't know this for a fact, but I have to imagine that maybe behind the scenes, ETS keeps an eye on what those word lists are and makes sure to include words that are not in it. So as far as a strategy of like, I'm going to become an expert at these 200, 300, 400, 500 words, and that's all I'm going to do, not the best. My philosophy is sort of quantity over quality.
Okay.
So expose yourself to as many words as you can, but don't worry so much about having them down cold. Because when it comes down to it, sometimes just having like a good sense of like the lean of a word, like, okay, this is a positive word, this is a negative word, oftentimes that's plenty, right?
Okay.
That's all you need to do. I would also say the most efficient way to study a lot of words is to learn word roots. So common prefixes, suffixes, and roots. So, and like CHRON, cron, right? It's
Hmm.
like time. So any time, chronology, right? Anytime that that root comes up in a word,
Hmm.
you have a pretty good sense of what that word's talking about. It has something to do with time.
I see. That's a fantastic tip. A strategy I employed years ago when I took the GRE, being very heavy on the quantitative side. My education was in engineering, and as an engineer, we reading is not a thing, and writing is not really a thing. So I try to expose myself to things like reading the Wall Street Journal, things like reading the New Yorker, different types of magazines that I know are very heavy when it comes to having abstract writings and things like that. Do you think that's still a good strategy today?
I think those are great publications, right? Like
Hmm.
Wall Street Journal, Economist, like especially Economist. Economist is nice
The
and dense.
Economist too. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I would say though, as far as efficiency and time efficiency, and I think reading those will make you more interesting in your
Hmm.
interviews. I see that more of like a luxury if you have several months to study. It can't hurt. It certainly can't hurt. But more important on the reading section, I would say, is getting familiar with the types of passages that you're going to see on the test. And here's a little study tip that I give because verbal material you really only want to study official ETS material for verbal, right? I'm all for using Manhattan, Kaplan, Princeton, Magoosh, like all those are great as supplements for math, but verbal questions are so carefully crafted that I would really
Hmm.
say you only want to do ETS official material for those. If you run out of ETS official material,
Hmm.
usually where I send people is the GMAT
Okay.
because
Mm.
the GMAT reading section, it's not identical to the GR, but it's very, very
Mm.
close. And the skills that you use are very, very similar.
I see.
GMAT questions tend to have more of a focus on business and economics, but the skills and the types of questions that you'll see on the GMAT are very, very similar to what you see on the GRE.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
If we can just brush up on the GRE, verbal, and the quantitative reasoning sections on the most common mistakes you see on both of those sections, I'd like to get your perspective there.
Let me think about that for a second. So, most common errors I see on quantitative reasoning. Well, I kind of go through this process when I'm working with students
Yeah.
of having them categorize their own mistakes as A, B, or C. So, A is, this was a silly mistake. I forgot to distribute the negative. I shouldn't have missed it. B is like, okay, I took some time to review it. I understand the concept now, and I probably get it next time. And C is like, I have no idea how to do this problem. I read the explanation, but I still don't understand it. Or maybe like it still took me, 5 minutes to do. So I would say, to answer your question, like it really varies from student to student, but the C level questions, the ones that a lot of people tend to miss, fall into kind of the probability, combinatorics, uh, higher level question types like that. And I'll just add a little bit to that and say that if you are gunning for a very high score, so a 160 plus level score, you do need to get those types of questions correct. You have to be prepared for those types of questions. However, if you're applying to a program, and I'll give an example like PA school or CRNA. I work with a lot of students kind of applying to those. Those programs tend to want scores in like the 150 to 155 range, and you really don't need to do that. So as far as like practical advice, I would say save those kind of tough questions for dessert. Save those probability combinatorics questions for once you're solid on everything else.
Mm-hmm. I see. Okay.
Yeah.
I would like to move over and talk about GRE prepping using official material and taking practice tests as well. So, and I like that that's a tip that you strongly advocate for, that people, your first resource when you're practicing for the GRE should be using official material. So outside of that, what other prep strategies do you have for people when it comes to taking practice tests for the GRE?
Sure. So recognize that practice tests are a very valuable and limited resource. The last standardized test that people probably took was the SAT. And there are tons of SAT official practice tests. You can kind of go through those like Kleenex. If you're just starting out on your GRE prep journey and you think like, before I study, I want to take a practice test just to see how I do, not the best idea, because the test is so kind of idiosyncratic, and there are certain strategies you just need to know about the format that I would say do a little bit of studying before you take a practice test. Just familiarize yourself with the types of questions. Non-official practice tests are not ideal, but they're not useless. So take them with a grain of salt. So if you take a practice Manhattan or Magoosh test, like those are good approximations, but just know that they are approximate. As far as using official practice material, I would say you study for a week or two, just familiarize yourself with the test, take a practice test, and you can count that as your baseline. That's kind of your starting point. And then you really, really want to squeeze everything you can out of that practice test. And what does that mean? It means redo the questions that you missed without looking at the answer options. It means read any answer explanation you can find, both through ETS and on like the online forums, because these questions have been around for decades at this point, and you have people online arguing about them. And that's great. I mean, you can go read why someone, supports answer option A. And then you want to kind of backload the rest of the practice tests for closer to your test date.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
I'd also like to ask a question about the adaptive nature of the GRE exam. What tip do you have there when it comes to people taking those practice tests?
Yeah. If you've never taken an adaptive test before, that it's an experience, right? Because what most people are used to, again, going back to the SAT, is you show up in your cafeteria at 9 a.m. on Saturday, and the gym teacher's proctoring, and you take the paper test. The SAT just switched to an adaptive test, by the way.
Right, exactly.
Right. But the adaptive nature of the GRE, the way it works, basically, I'll just give a quick summary in case people aren't super familiar.
Right.
You take the first verbal section. Depending on how you perform in that section, the second verbal section is either difficult, medium, or easy. And you'll notice the change. Like the questions will get significantly harder if you do well on the first section. The best advice I can give about dealing with the stress of that adaptive test is don't think about it. You almost want to have like a passive approach to it and say like, I am letting the test read me. Like if I have done my studying and I know these types of questions, the test just needs to do its thing. I have to accept the fact that I'm going to miss some questions because the test is trying to push me to my limit. But if you can let that go and just focus on the questions that you can answer, you will do much, much better.
I see. I see. Yeah, that's a really, really great tip when it comes to taking these adaptive exams. Thankfully, the GRE is not as bad as the GMAT, which is adaptive by question. It's adaptive by section.
Yeah.
So I'm quite sure you come across students who might be considering taking the GRE versus the GMAT. Say you're applying to certain business schools that are very open to accepting both exams. What's your advice when it comes to those students who are contemplating between taking the GRE or taking the GMAT?
Sure. So I'll just say this. I have never had a student move from the GRE to the GMAT. I've had plenty go the other direction.
The other way.
Right.
Yeah.
And the bottom line is content wise, and this is a little different now because the GMAT just changed too, right? The GMAT lost
GMAT.
geometry and the sentence corrections.
Mhm.
But content wise, the two tests they cover the same areas. The thing that makes the GMAT so much more difficult, as you just said, is the question adaptive nature.
Yeah.
You're kind of in this constant battle of, is this question worth attempting? And I know now the new version, you can go back and change certain answers. They made it a little bit better.
Yeah,
slightly. But you still, what's nice about the GRE is you have the luxury of being able to jump around from question to question, right? And sort of prioritize which ones you want to do. And psychologically, that is just so much more right. And now I'll just say to play devil's advocate a little bit for the GMAT. I think the GMAT is a great test. I think it's an interesting test and it really pushes you to your limit. And I think it's great, but like, I'm not the target demographic for this test because this is what I do for a living. I respect it as a testing instrument, but the GRE is definitely the path of least resistance.
I see. Yeah, take the easy road if you have to.
Right.
At the end of the day, both of these exams are just standardized tests. It's not a badge of honor that you took the most difficult exam. So I like to just go into asking the question about test anxiety, GRE test anxiety, and if you have any tips you could give us there.
Absolutely. I'll say, like, I'm not just about the content and like knowing the strategies. Like I build that in when I'm working with students. So I always try to have an open conversation about like what is stressing you out about this, et cetera. And I'll tell you an example. I was teaching a class one time and I said, we're going to start on geometry. And this woman just broke down in tears because she had had such a terrible experience with geometry in, 10th grade. It brought something back for her. So I am all about sort of acknowledging test anxiety and working through it. The sort of blunt answer is the only way to get through test anxiety is to practice testing. So certainly if you're making a study schedule or a plan for when you're going to take the official test, build in time for a retest, because if it's your first time taking the test, nerves might take over. But if you take it the second or third time, it becomes a little more familiar to you. So that's the first thing I would say is build in time for it. And then in your actual like practice, when you're studying, try to simulate the testing environment as much as you can. So if you plan to take the test at the center, and I can talk a little more about this if you want me to, but
sure, go ahead.
If you're planning to take the test at the center, I would practice studying in the library, right? An environment that sort of approximates what you're going to see on test day.
I see.
Or maybe like when you take your practice test, you go to a WeWork or something for a day, just to get that experience. And then of course, if you know that you're going to test at home, practice testing at home.
Is that something you also advise students to also choose between practicing at home versus practicing at a test center if they have the option to?
Yeah. So first off, this is a very personal sort of decision, right?
Of
Because
course.
people feel more comfortable in different environments. Some people don't feel comfortable testing at home, and they need the testing center for that focus.
Hmm.
And then other people like don't want to deal with anyone else, so they stay at home. Here's what I'll say. My default recommendation is take it at the testing center. And
Okay.
the reason why is really a logistical one. If anything goes wrong at the testing center, it's not your fault. That's on them. And
Hmm.
I can't speak for ETS, but if something ridiculous happens, like the power goes out, or
Lose internet.
yeah, whatever,
Yeah.
I assume that they will offer you the option to retest for free. I
Hmm.
assume. I can't speak for them. However, if something happens at your house with your internet, sorry, like that's on you.
Hmm.
And then the other piece of it too is the proctors. So at the testing center, the proctors are literally professional. They're like professional proctors. This is what they do. This is their job. When you're testing at home, you're not getting the same proctors. You're usually getting someone, and it sounds like they're in like a call center because there's like a bunch of noise in the background. Oftentimes, they don't really know what test they're proctoring. They've just
Hmm.
opened it up. Sometimes they'll leave, and you're sitting there saying like, "Hey, I'm ready to start the next," or I have a question about this. I've heard more horror stories about at-home testing than I have
Yeah.
at the center. But really, it comes down to your comfort level.
I see. I see. Wow. It's really, really good, man. This has really been a great conversation. You've given us a lot of just gems, straight up gems right there when it comes to preparing for the GRE. Andrew,
Yeah,
can you tell us more about where we can get more from you, and what direction you like to point people to get more from you?
absolutely. Yeah. And thanks for having me, first of all. If you're interested in kind of seeing my offerings, you can check out my website, which is testprepstudios.com. You can send me an email at testprepstudios@gmail.com. I'm also on TikTok at Test Prep Studios and YouTube, Test Prep Studios. And then as far as like what I offer, I do one-on-one tutoring. I also have a 16-hour course that covers everything you need to know for the test, and a self-paced video course, which is, as it sounds, self-paced
Hmm.
and covers the same material that's in the live course.
That's fantastic. And we'll make sure to include links to all of Andrew's website and his YouTube channel and everything in the show notes of this podcast. So you'll be able to get more from Andrew for sure. Andrew, thank you so much for joining the Sojourner Scholar podcast. You've been a wealth of knowledge, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future.
Likewise. Thanks so much.
All right, take care.